A hardened widower, Elijah Ward lives alone in the high country, content with silence and haunted by loss. When a fierce outlaw girl and her young brother arrive on his doorstep, their fates intertwine in unexpected ways. Bound by necessity but divided by secrets, their fragile peace is threatened when the past comes riding hard behind them. Pull up a chair, kick off your boots, and pour yourself something warm, the kind that chases off the prairie chill. This tale begins 3 months earlier, in the town of Willow Creek, Montana Territory, June of 1879. Back then, the streets were still dust, and folks still nodded their howdy with meaning. Miss Clara Whitmore, daughter of the town's judge, wore her reputation like Sunday lace, proper, polished, and pinned down. But behind that corseted smile was a heart full of wildfire. And when love came calling, it didn't knock. It climbed through her window under moonlight, boots muddy and grin reckless. Sometimes, the family you choose is the one fate blows in with the storm. Out here, on the edge of everything, a man don't get to pick what's taken from him. The land takes. The wind, the cold, time itself, all of it pulls pieces off you till there ain't much left but silence and the scrape of boots on a cabin floor. You live long enough out here alone, and even your own voice starts to feel like a stranger's. But once in a great while, the storm don't come to strip you bare. Sometimes it brings something else. Something lost. Something wild and broken that still carries the scent of life in it. And when it knocks at your door, all shivering and scared, a man has to decide, keep the door shut and stay safe, or open it and take his chances with grace. This story begins on a night colder than sin and quieter than the grave, when the past lay buried deep in snowdrifts and the future hadn't yet taken shape. And on that night, an outlaw girl came running through the blizzard, bringing with her a whole mess of trouble, and the kind of salvation that don't wear a halo. The wind had been crawling under the eaves since the start of December, gnawing like a hungry dog. Snow lay thick across the land, smothering the hills in silence, and the trees stood stiff as if frozen mid-prayer. Up near the ridgeline, where even coyotes thought twice about lingering, stood a squat log cabin, smoke curling slow from the chimney like the breath of some tired beast. Inside, Elijah Ward moved quiet as a shadow. He rose before the sun always had, even though there weren't no one around to tell time to anymore. Coffee boiled over hickory coals, black and bitter, same as the thoughts that rode shotgun in his mind most days. He split kindling in the lean-to, then stacked it near the stove, hands wrapped in worn leather gloves, the fingers patched and repatched over years of stubborn use. His world was made of habits. Feed the fire. Check the traps. Keep the fences from leanin'. Speak not at all unless there was something worth sayin'. Which, in his case, there seldom was. Elijah hadn't always been this way. Once, there'd been laughter in that cabin. A woman's hands makin' bread. The soft cry of a baby, too small to understand what kind of world he'd been born into. But that was 10 winters ago. Fever took 'em both by Christmas. Too far from town, too proud to ask for help. He'd buried them with his own hands, ground frozen near solid, and marked their graves with river stones and a quiet prayer that cracked when it left his mouth. Since then, the place had grown quiet as a church pew on a weekday. Grizz, the old mutt that stuck with him, didn't bark much these days. Just laid by the hearth and watched the door, same as Elijah. There were no visitors, no neighbors for miles. Once in a while, he'd see smoke on the horizon, other cabins maybe, or drifters set tin up camp, but none came close. Folks knew better than to go both errand a man who wore his grief like a second coat. The days passed with little difference. Chop. Carry. Patch. Eat. Write a line or two in a leather-bound book he didn't intend for nobody to ever read. He kept it under his cot, mostly filled with memories too heavy to speak aloud. Sometimes he'd sit by the fire, journal open, lips moving to words he didn't say. He didn't know he was waitin'. Not then. Didn't know that fate was already drawin' breath just over the next hill. That something with eyes like firelight and bones worn thin by runnin' was headin' straight for his door. He just knew the wind was blowin' colder than usual, and that the kind of storm that changes everything was set in. The storm came sudden, though any man with sense could feel it crawlin' down from the high peaks that mornin'. The air'd been too still, too mean somehow, like the land itself was holdin' its breath. Elijah felt it in his bones while chopping wood behind the cabin, a sting in his knuckles that warned of something worse than cold on its way. The pine branches stood brittle, heavy with old snow, and even Grizz, usually half lazy by dusk, had started passing near the porch with his tail low and eyes cut toward the hills. By sundown, the wind had turned. Not a whistle, but a low groaning sound, like wagon wheels grinding over stone. Elijah bolted the shutters, banked the fire, and laid out extra wood inside the cabin. The dog curled close to the stove, and the oil lamp flickered on the table, casting long shadows across the log walls. Night dropped hard, and with it came the snow-thick, wet flakes that slapped the roof like thrown sand and buried the world faster than a man could think. Elijah sat at the table, cradling his tin cup, watching the door. Just have it. Nothing ever came knocking. But that night, the wind carried a sound he hadn't heard in years. A voice. Faint. Ragged. Barely more than a scrape in the dark. Grizz sat up first, ears pricked. Elijah frowned, stood slow, and went to the door. He cracked it open and a wall of snow-laced wind near shoved him backward. For a moment, he figured it was his own mind betraying him, grief talking again. But then he heard it clear. Help! He stepped out onto the porch, lantern high, rifle slung across his shoulder. The storm bit through his coat like needles. He scanned the white until he caught movement, small, staggering, like two shadows wrestling their way through the gale. He moved fast, boots crunching through snow that came near mid-thigh. As he neared, the shapes became clearer, a girl, lean and wild-eyed, dragging a boy behind her who was half collapsed. She looked up, face hollow, mouth cracked. Please, she choked. He's gonna die. Elijah didn't ask questions. He handed her the lantern. Hold this. Then he bent, lifted the boy onto his back, light as a sack of oats, and turned toward the cabin. Inside, the fire blazed hot, and the smell of cedar smoke hung thick in the air. Elijah kicked the door shut with his heel, set the boy on his bedroll near the stove, and turned to the girl. She stood just inside the threshold, shivering, clothes soaked straight through. She looked like she hadn't eaten proper in days. Hair tangled, lip split, a bruise bloomed just beneath her eye. Still, she stayed upright. Fierce in a way that didn't come from age or size. Get them wet things off, he said, voice quiet but firm. Ain't no good fightin' cold with pride. She hesitated, just for a second, then nodded. The boy moaned in his sleep. Elijah stripped off the frozen boots from his feet, saw the skin beneath gone pale and cracked. Frostbite, but not yet past savon. He worked without speaking. Quilts over the boy. Kettle on the fire. Extra logs thrown in for good measure. The girl wrapped herself in an old blanket, hands trembling as she crouched near the stove. What's your name? He asked at last. Lottie, she whispered. His name's Eli. He nodded once. Whatever they'd been running from was out there still, buried now in snow. But in that small cabin, for just one night, the storm had lost. The storm hammered against the cabin walls like it meant to get inside. Elijah stood at the hearth, stoking the fire high, the glow licking up the chimney like a tongue starved for warmth. Outside, the wind howled through the pine like a church choir gone mad. Inside, there was breath, 3 of 'em now, and none wasted on words. The boy, Eli, lay curled in the bedroll nearest the fire, wrapped in quilts that still smelled of cedar and old tobacco. His skin had color again, thank the Lord. Feet were raw but warming up, one wrapped tight in cell-soaked bandage. Elijah had done what he could, careful not to say out loud how close the boy'd come to losing him. Lottie hadn't moved much since they came in. She sat in the rocker by the fire, wearing one of Elijah's old flannel shirts that near swallowed her frame. Her own clothes, torn skirt, threadbare coat hung from pegs by the stove, still drip-pin. She stared into the flames like they were speaking to her. Elijah handed her a tin cup of broth. She took it without a word and drank slow. Her hands shook, but her eyes never left the fire. You from round here? He asked. She gave a slow shake of her head. South a ways. Driftin' dot. He didn't press. He could see she wasn't ready. Folks got the right to keep their story close when it's fresh and sore. Grizz padded over and lay at Eli's feet. The boy stirred then, eyes fluttering open, dazed but breathing easy. "Where?" he murmured. "You're safe," Elijah said. The boy blinked, then looked toward Lottie. She rose fast and came to his side, laying a hand on his hair, her touch gentle in a way that told you she'd raised him more than anyone else. "You're all right now," she whispered. "I got us through." Elijah turned away, giving them privacy, and started ladling out more broth from the pot. The smell filled the room, heavy with meat and salt nourishment. He hadn't cooked for anyone else in near a decade. Hadn't heard children's breath in his cabin since he'd buried his own. Later, after they'd both eaten, Lottie helped him clean the bowls, moving slow but sure. She was no stranger to work, that much was clear. Her fingers were rough, with small scars running along the knuckles, hands that had fought for every scrap of good they'd known. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. Elijah nodded. "Storm's got a mean grip. Would have taken you both before morning. We've seen worse," she muttered. "But, not much." Eli had fallen back asleep, cheeks flushed with life now, his breathing soft and steady. Lottie stood over him a while, one hand on the quilt. Elijah could see it in her shoulders, how the weight never quite left. Even in warmth, even in safety, she wore her fear like a second skin. "I ain't the law," he told her. "Ain't lookin' to turn no one in or ask questions that ain't mine to ask." She looked over her shoulder. "Then why'd you open your door?" Elijah paused, then answered plain. "Seemed the right thing." He left it at that. The cabin settled into a hush. Not the empty kind Elijah had lived with for years, but a shared quiet. The kind that held breath, not absence. As the firelight danced across the walls and the wind outside roared without finding purchase, Elijah sat in his old chair by the stove, watching the two of them. A girl and a boy, wrapped in layers not just of cloth but of weariness. Survivors. Running from something he didn't know yet. But tonight, they were warm. Tonight, they were safe. And for the first time in a long while, so was he. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the way Elijah was used to. It was a living kind of quiet now, full of movement, breath, and the occasional thump of Eli's boots on the floor as he learned his way round the cabin. The boy took to the place quick, like a pup finned in new ground. He helped with chores when he could, carry in firewood, feed in Grizz, poking his nose into every corner with the kind of curiosity Elijah hadn't seen in years. But Lottie, she stayed cautious. She didn't sit long, didn't sleep deep. Always near the window. Always watching the tree line like she expected hell to come riding through it. Elijah didn't ask what she feared. He figured when the time came, she'd say it plain. Or she wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't his to force. He could see the hard living in her. Not just in the bruises and the way she flinched at sudden sounds, but in the way she spoke, if she spoke at all. Words were picked careful, and always few. But her hands worked steady. She mended a torn quilt without being asked. Scrubbed the kettle one morning like it had wronged her personally. The snow eased some by the fifth day, though the wind still cut sharp. Elijah took Eli with him to check the snares, teaching him how to spot tracks, how to know when a rabbit had come by and when it was just the wind playing tricks. The boy soaked it up like dry earth after a storm. One night, after the boy had gone to bed and the fire had died down to coals, Lottie sat at the table, turning a wooden spoon over in her hands. "You ever lose someone?" she asked. Elijah didn't answer right away. He watched the flame flicker low inside the lantern, heard the stove creak with the last of its heat. "My wife," he said finally. "And my boy. 10 winters back. Fever came fast. Couldn't get 'em to town in time. Weren't nothing to do but hold her hand and pray she didn't hurt too long." Lottie nodded slow. "I had a mama once. She got herself gone trying to keep us from starvin'. After that, it was just Pa. He didn't take to raisin' kindly." She didn't go into detail, and Elijah didn't ask. But the pain in her voice was thick enough to carry its own truth. He looked at her, then really looked, and saw not just a girl survivin', but someone who'd carried too much weight for too many miles. "He hit you?" Elijah asked, quiet. She didn't answer. Didn't have to. Eli's your brother? She nodded. Been looking after him since he was born. More mine than his, most days. Silence settled between them again, but it wasn't cold. Later, she spoke again. You ever feel like God forgot about you? Elijah ran a hand over his beard. I reckon I did. For a long time. Some days I still do. She looked away, eyes glinting in the firelight. Maybe he ain't forgot. Maybe he's just real late. The wind moaned outside, but it felt far away now. The cabin held steady. Over the next week, things shifted. Lottie started to hum when she swept the floor. Just under her breath, not a tune Elijah recognized. Elijah caught himself talking more than he used to. Small things. How to patch a roof, how to keep weasels out the henhouse, how the first snow every year always comes in mean and leaves soft. She listened. And sometimes she smiled. The tension was still there, like the edge of a blade kept under the table, but it dulled a little each day. The cabin, once a tomb of old memories, was slowly filling with new ones. The kind that didn't weigh so heavy. One morning, Elijah woke to the smell of fresh biscuits. Not great ones burnt on the bottom, doughy in the middle, but it near broke something in him just the same. He sat at the table, watching Lottie plate them with the careful pride of someone who hadn't had a kitchen to call her own in a long while. You trying to make me soft, he muttered, half a grin on his lips. She shrugged. Might be it's too late for that. He didn't reply. Didn't need to. Something was changing. Slowly. Quietly. Like the way snow melts without sound. And for the first time in years, Elijah Ward wasn't afraid of what the thaw might bring. The snow let up slow, like a man who don't know how to say goodbye. By late February, the white began to pull back from the hills, revealing bits of brown earth and dead grass underneath. Drips from the eaves tapped out a lazy rhythm, and the wind came softer now, more tired than mean. You could smell the mud in the thaw, and hear birds trying out their songs again, unsure if it was safe to come back. Elijah stood on the porch, coat open, pipe in hand. Grizz lay curled at his feet, half asleep, muzzle flecked with gray. From where he stood, he could see the ridge trail cutting back through the trees, clear now, if still a little slick. Passable. Behind him, the cabin was alive with the sound of moving bodies. Lottie was packing. She hadn't said it outright, but Elijah knew the signs. The way she kept fixing the straps on her satchel. The way she folded each of Eli's shirts real careful and stared too long at the fire when she thought no one was looking. She was reading herself. He didn't blame her. Folks like her didn't stay in one place long. Too many miles behind. Too many more ahead. The kind of girl who learned young that nothing given lasts long. That night, after supper, Lottie finally spoke it plain. We'll be going come morning, she said, eyes fixed on the spoon she was drying. Snow's cleared enough. Eli's strong again. Elijah didn't look up from his chair. He just nodded slow. You got kin? He asked. She hesitated. No one worth thinned in. Might head west. Maybe Dakota, maybe Oregon. Ain't decided. Eli was asleep by then, curled under the patchwork quilt like he'd always belonged there. I can't offer much, Elijah said after a long pause. But the place is yours, if you want it. Both of you. Ain't fancy, but it's warm. Ain't rich, but it's honest. She looked up at him then. Really looked. You don't even know what we're running from. I reckon it don't matter. She folded the towel slow. The fire popped, and the shadows danced along the walls. You're a good man, she said. He didn't answer that. Never much liked being called good. Didn't feel true. I've been living alone a long time, he said instead. And maybe I got used to the quiet. But lately, maybe the silence has been too quiet. Lottie stared at the fire again. Her fingers twitched like she wanted to reach for something, but didn't know what. What if it follows us, she asked, near a whisper. Then we need it together, Elijah said. She didn't speak for a long while. Just sat there, listening to the stove crackle, the wind whimper through the chimney like it knew it had lost. In the end, she didn't give him an answer. She just rose early the next morning, same as usual, and started unpacking the satchel she'd packed the night before. And Elijah, standing in the doorway with his coffee and that old ache in his chest, didn't say a word. He just smiled a little, turned back to the sunrise, and let the silence fill in the rest. It was near the end of March when Elijah hitched up the mule and took Lottie and Eli down into town. The road was still half mud, half ice, and the cart creaked something fierce on the bends, but the air carried a hint of warmth now, and the sky didn't look so heavy no more. Birds were back in the trees, singing like they'd never left. Eli leaned forward on the seat, eyes wide at every fence post and stranger he passed, like the world was being made new right in front of him. Lottie sat stiff beside Elijah, hands in her lap, eyes scanning every corner like trouble might be hiding behind a storefront or under a wagon wheel. She wore a hand-stitched dress Elijah's wife had left behind, brown wool, clean but plain. It fit well enough. She'd insisted on mending the seams herself. They rode in quiet mostly. Elijah didn't press. He figured she'd speak when she had something to say. Sheridan wasn't much of a town, just 2 dusty streets and a rail spur, but to folks like Lottie and Eli, it was a whole different world. The general store was open, a couple ranchers leaning against the Ryland out front, hats low, eyes sharp. The post office flag whipped in the wind. Miss Harden stood outside the mercantile in her usual black shawl, her mouth drawn like she'd bit into a lemon. Elijah tipped his hat as they passed. Inside the store, Lottie stayed close, never more than a few steps from Eli. The boy gawked at barrels of licorice and tin toys stacked beside canned peaches, but never touched. Elijah filled the basket with sugar, flour, lamp oil, staples. "Don't need to get fancy," Lottie whispered. "Ain't about fancy," Elijah said. "It's about living like you mean to stay." At the counter, old Cal Hensley raised an eyebrow. "Got yourself some help these days, Ward?" Elijah looked him in the eye. "This here's Lottie. And that's Eli. They're with me." Cal grunted, didn't say more. But Miss Harden, of course, wasn't done. She stepped in from the porch as they were loading up the wagon. Looked Lottie up and down like she was a stray dog. "She yours?" she asked Elijah, low but clear. He turned, shoulders squaring. "She's family," he said. "And if anyone thinks to say different, they best be sure I'm in a kind mood." Miss Harden pursed her lips, said nothing. Just turned and walked off in a flurry of skirts. Back on the wagon, Lottie stared down at her hands. "You didn't have to do that." "Didn't do it for you," Elijah said, then softened. "Did it 'cause truth don't need defendin'. But sometimes you speak it loud so folks remember it's still there." The ride back was quieter than the ride in. But different. More settled. Lottie sat easier, the wind catching her hair now and again, and she didn't tuck it back right away. Eli clutched a small tin toy Elijah had bought him without saying a word. That night, after the mule was put up and the fire burned steady again, Lottie poured water for tea and said, soft as the steam rising from the cup, "I don't know what this is yet. But it's more than I ever had." Elijah nodded, not looking at her directly. "We'll figure it as we go," he said. Outside, the stars were bright. And for the first time in a long while, the cabin felt like it belonged to the world again. The spring rains came late that year, soft and scattered, leaving the land patched with green but thirsty still. The air held that clean smell of thawed dirt and pine sap, and the creek behind the cabin finally ran full enough to sing again. Elijah sat out on the porch most evenings now, boots crossed at the ankle, pipe in hand, watching the last of the light spill over the trees. Lottie had taken to work in the small garden bed out front, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back with a bit of blue ribbon she'd found buried in one of his wife's old trunks. She moved with quiet purpose. Never wasted motion. And when Eli laughed like he was doing now while chasing Grizz barefoot across the yard, she'd pause just long enough to let that sound settle inside her. Elijah noticed. That night, after Eli was asleep and the dishes were washed, they sat across from each other at the table. No rush to go anywhere, just the soft hum of firewood crackling and the faint creak of the roof timbers settling in. Lottie stirred her tea slowly. Elijah cleared his throat once, then again. "I been thinkin'," he said. She looked up, brows lifting a little but not surprised. "Reckon I knew that already." He scratched his chin. "This arrangement, you and the boy here, me out choppin' wood and tryin' to remember which boots are dry. It's workin', far as I can tell." She gave a slow nod. "I know it ain't proper, the way some folks think on things. A man livin' with a young woman under the same roof, no preacher's word between 'em. And I'm not sayin' we need to be somethin' we ain't. But I figure, maybe we could be partners. Raise Eli proper. Share the land. You'd have a name that folks respect, and I wouldn't mind the company." Lottie didn't speak right away. Her hands stayed around the cup, still and steady. "You proposin' marriage?" she asked, not unkindly. "Just straight. I'm proposin' somethin' steady. Somethin' decent," he said. "A home you don't have to leave. No expectations. Just a place that's yours too." She looked toward the window, where the lantern light cast long shadows against the glass. "I never thought I'd get asked," she said, voice low. "Not like that. Not clean." Elijah felt the air shift in the room, the way it does before a storm or a blessing. He didn't push. He'd said his piece. Finally, Lottie met his eyes. "You ain't said nothin' about love." He nodded. "I reckon love comes different to everyone. For me, it's quiet. It's watchin' you hang Eli's wash in the sun and feelin' like the world's right. I don't know if that's the kind folks write poems about. But it's honest." She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded once, slow and certain. "All right, Elijah Ward. We'll do it our way. But I ain't wearin' no corset." He chuckled, the sound dry and surprised even to his own ears. "Deal." She poured him a cup of tea without saying another word, and he took it without a skin for sugar. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines like a whisper that had waited a long time to be heard. 3 years passed, quiet and sure as a wagon rollin' down a dirt road with no hurry to it. The homestead grew not in size so much, but in shape, in feel, in the kind of ways that can't be measured in feet or timber. The second room Elijah had long meant to build finally stood, nailed with care and painted pale blue by Lottie herself one long July afternoon. A proper door for Eli, who was nearly as tall as Elijah's shoulder now and had a mind sharper than most grown men. The boy spent his mornings at the school Lottie started in the front room. Just 6 pupils, ranch hands, kids, merchant girls, but it was enough to fill the air with voices and the scent of chalk and worn books. Lottie kept the lessons firm and fair, her tone never loud, but never soft enough to be mistaken for weakness. She had a way of making herself heard without ever raising her voice. Afternoons, Eli helped Elijah in the field, learnin' how to mend fence wire, patch roof shingles, and hitch the mule cart without snappin' the reins. He took to woodwork like he was born with a blade in his hand, and by his 12th summer had already built a dovetail box for Lottie's sewing and a stool that Elijah swore was steadier than any chair he'd ever sat in. Elijah, for his part, moved slower now, but more content than he ever remembered bein'. His shoulders still ached come evenin', and the scar on his wrist always stiffened in the rain, but his hands stayed busy, and his mind, for the first time in years, no longer drifted too far back. He kept to his journal, though now it held more than sorrow. Pages filled with Eli's clever sayings, things Lottie said in passing that stuck, the way the light fell across the kitchen table in the fall when the windows steamed from stew on the stove. Nothing profound. Just life, slow and full. Sundays became their own kind of tradition. No preacher out that far, so Elijah read from the good book himself. Not loud, not preachin', just steady. They'd sit on the porch afterward, Lottie with her mending, Eli whittling, Elijah smoking his pipe, watching the sun make gold out of pine bark. Visitors came from time to time. Sheriff McKinnon stopped by for coffee now and again, always leaving with a nod and a slice of Lottie's cornbread. Miss Harden even sent over pickled beets one Christmas, along with a handwritten note saying she was wrong in judgment. Lottie pinned it to the inside of the pantry door and never spoke of it again. In the small things, they found rhythm. At night, Elijah would watch Lottie braid her hair by lamplight and feel something solid settle in his chest. Not the fiery love of youth, he'd known that once, and lost it. This was different. This was worn-in boots and a coat that fit just right. Love that showed itself in warm meals, in a hand steadying yours when you bent down too quick, in three voices singing off-key while doing dishes. They planted a young oak out back behind the cabin, not far from the old graves Elijah still visited in quiet moments. He'd kneel sometimes, touch the earth, say a few words that didn't carry far. And when he stood, he'd look toward the new tree, thin but rooted deep. One summer night, Eli came to him on the porch, hair wet from the creek, cheeks flushed from running. "Think I'll build a house out here one day," he said. Elijah didn't say nothing for a moment. Just looked out across the field, watched the sun droppin' behind the ridge. "Reckon you will," he said. "And I'll help you set the first stone." And that was enough. The land didn't change much. The work stayed hard. But in the cracks between chores, between seasons, between heartbeats, they'd made a life. Not perfect. Not easy. But true. And sometimes, when Elijah woke in the middle of the night, hearing the soft breath of sleep from the other room, feeling Lottie's arm tucked gentle over his own, he'd stare into the darkness and think. Maybe this is what it meant to be saved. Not by angels. Not by gunfire or glory. But by stayin'. By choosin' not to run. By lettin' someone in. The wind was softer now, older somehow. Elijah Ward stood atop the small rise behind the cabin, hat in hand, the early autumn sunset tin slow behind the ridge. The oak tree they'd planted years back cast a long shadow across the graves, two older markers worn smooth by time, and one new one, just months in the ground. No fancy stone. Just a wooden cross, carved by Eli's hand, and a name burned into it with a branding iron, Elijah Ward, husband, father, friend. Down below, the cabin stood steady, smoke curling up from the chimney like always. Lottie moved between the porch and the chicken coop, apron full of feed, callin' gentle to the hens. Eli, tall now, broad-shouldered, was hammering shingles onto the new barn, his sleeves rolled, jaw set like his stepfather's had been. The world hadn't changed much. The pines still whispered the same way when the wind passed through 'em, and the creek still babbled come spring. But in that stretch of land, in that rough-hewn home, something had taken root that was deeper than blood. It hadn't come easy. Lottie'd once been a runaway with a busted lip and fire behind her eyes. Eli, a half-starved boy who clung to her like a shadow. And Elijah, he'd been a man already halfway buried in his own silence. A man who thought he'd seen all he was meant to see. And yet, a knock at the door in a snowstorm changed all of it. The townsfolk never quite understood. They still talked, sometimes, in whispers. About how she'd come out of nowhere. How her kin never came looking again after that first time, a rough man with a badge and a posse, who left limpin' and humiliated after Elijah met him at the edge of town, rifle slung low but steady. The sheriff hadn't asked questions after that. Folks learned to let things lie. Years rolled on. And with them came days full of small joys, Eli's first fish from the creek, Lottie Logan at the breakfast table, the way Elijah learned to hum again without noticin'. A man don't always know when he's been pulled back from the edge. Sometimes he just looks up one day and finds the fire warm again, and the chair across from him no longer empty. He thought he was rescuing them from the storm. But it turned out, they'd rescued him. And for a man like Elijah Ward, that was more salvation than any preacher could promise.